Welcome back to this video series on how to create a grocery list app. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to configure our database within our application. So let's go ahead and jump back to our application. And before we do that, let's actually look at a few slides here before we begin to code some of this out. So there's a couple different steps that you want to go through in terms of configuring your database, or configuring or implementing an SQL-like database specifically. So the step one is you want to download and install the database drivers. So whenever you're working with any particular database for a particular application, you need to download the drivers for that specific database. So MySQL has specific drivers. If you're doing like a NoSQL database like MongoDB, they have database drivers that you want to install, and then you just have to look at the documentation to figure out how to configure that database and use some of the functionality that these drivers that they make available to you. So in our case here, we've already installed SQLite. We did that within the first video of this series, and what we're going to do now is make sure that we have access to the database that we just created in the previous video. So I'm going to copy this code here, and I'll make some modifications and do this for quicker iteration. Go back to our code, and then I created a file called database.js in the first video. It's empty, and what I'm going to do is paste that code into the file here. So here, this allows us to create an instance, makes the driver available for us. So we have the require statement that brings in, allow us to use some of the functionality for SQLite 3. Here, we're gonna create a new database instance. In this case here, we created a database, and one important piece I want to talk about here is that you'll see that it created this grocery DB. I didn't create this file. But whenever you're using the interface, the particular interface for the DB browser, you want to close the database because you can't do either or. You have to either query from within the interface, the DB browser interface, or you have to work with the database from within your application. So I'll save those changes, and now it's closed, and so I can minimize that, and you'll see that that file goes away. So that's one of the things you want to be cautious about when you're working with DB browser. What I'm going to do, we have the database in our folder structure. It's called grocerydb.db. So I'm going to give it that name, and it's within the home or root folder of application. So it's // and we'll just say grocerydb.db. So that's the first argument. It's the file path of where we can locate the database. The second argument is going to be what access level, or do you want to have like open, read, write, create database? Let's say, for instance, the database is not located here at this location. Do you want SQLite to actually create the database on the fly? And so this here, second argument specifies what operations you can perform. In this case here, I already have my database created. I only want to open it up and do read, write, access. And then the third is the callback function, which is this saying that we have an error message. We can make amends for that if the error were to occur. If not, we'll say, hey, successfully connected to the SQLite database. So let's test our database out. Let's save it. And one easy way to test out our database is just instead of saying npm start, we could just go ahead and do the node command and just say node database.js. And there we go. We're connected to the SQLite database, and that's what we're looking for, is this output statement here. So the next thing what we're going to do is we're going to add some queries to our database.js file. Now I'm doing this all in one file, and I would recommend if you're just starting off to do the same thing. And the best thing to do is just to comment the queries you need. And these are going to be very similar to the queries that the comments that I made for my route. So there's going to be a query to create a grocery list item. It's going to be a query to delete grocery list item. And there's going to be a query to display all grocery list items. And these comments will be the basis for how I'll structure out my database code, the code I will use to interact with my database. So let's begin to work on the code for how to create a grocery list item. All right, so what do you need to begin writing these queries, right? Like, where do you start? Now, there's some resources that I'll make available. I'll post some resources inside the comment section or in the description section. But in this case here, I'm going to put a comment here and I'm going to paste it in. And we're going to come back to these in just a second here. But we're going to need some functions that we're going to trigger and call, because we're going to use these functions outside of the database.js class or database.js file. And we're going to use them within our app.js. So we're going to create some basic functions here. So the first one I want to say let is the variable name, and we'll create a function called create item. Okay, so here's what we have thus far, is just a create item. So we could have wrote that function like that, or we could have done something like this. Right, they both are the same thing, but I'll show you the reason why, because we're going to be exporting these here. So I'm going to create it in this particular fashion because I want to export it in a certain way here. So so here we have create item. And then within the create item, I'm going to create a variable that's going to hold the query. Now, you don't have to do it in this way, but I want to break it down so we can actually see all of the various steps that it would take to execute one of the database functions. So here I'll just say var create grocery list item. And then I'm going to specify my insert statement. And so I'll say insert into, and then what I'm going to do here is to switch over to I'll just copy that. And I'm going to do something called parameterized queries, and it helps against something called SQL injection or SQL injection. So let me just structure this out a little bit more. There we go. So it helps protect your application from people just putting random queries into your input boxes and trying to drop your database or trying to reveal information. So here, grocery items, we have item name, item count, and then the values here I put as question marks. Again, that's something called parameterized queries, which is actually a really significant security measure. And there's more things you can do, but this is a small step in the right direction. Now we have to populate this information. So previously we had data. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create some parameters for this information. So I'll say var params, or you can name that anything you want. I just typically say params, and then here I'll I'll pass in the data that I want to input. And so this data will come from the end user in terms of what they'll pass in for this function. And so we'll create a function called create item, and we'll pass in the item name and the item count. And so here we'll say item name and item count. Now here, let me go back up to lines 18, 19, and 20. There's a comment within SQLite 3. They give you this ability to utilize these three different functions. So in this case here, I am going to use this first one called run, used to create or alter tables and to insert or update data, table data. This next one here is get. It's whenever you're using a select statement, or so select a single row. And then here all if you want to select multiple rows and bring them back into your application. So we're going to use run because we're going to create a record. We're inserting a record. So here to do that, now we're going to go back up. Remember we created an instance of our SQLite 3 database. So we're going to use this variable db and then call on one of these methods, run, get, or all. And so we're going to use run. So we'll say db.run. And this one is going to take three different arguments. The first argument is actually the query. So we put our query into a variable. You could have just wrote this whole statement inside of the right here, but we're going to we assign that query to a variable. And so ours is called create grocery list item. And then the second one is what is the parameterized values or the variables that we're going to pass in for these parameterized question marks or parameterized query. And so in ours is params. And then the last thing is going to be the callback function. So function, and then we'll pass in the error message. And then here we'll just say if error, and we'll output or return console.log error message. If not, what we'll do is we'll say console.log and we'll say grocery item created, and then we'll get a message back from the system. We'll use that as well. So we'll say rows inserted, and this is called string interpolation. This dot changes. All right, and that would do it for our first query that's going to insert a record. Now what I'm going to do is for a quicker iteration, I'm going to pause this video and I'm going to create two more queries. One is going to be for the delete, and then the other one's going to be to display all grocery lists, and I'll just talk through them before I end this video. And in the next video, we'll go through and then talk about how we can actually use these functions that we created in this database.js file. So let me pause here. All right, so I've populated each of my functions with the appropriate database functions that I need to delete and get all the items. So here I have a get all items function, and then I have my query, and I execute the db all. In this case here, I want to select multiple rows, and so it's going to return not just only one row, but it's going to return all the rows that it finds when it runs this query. And so here I have rows, and I like to do a log things out to the console just to make sure things are working. So in the next video, I want to test these functions out just to make sure that they're working before we actually start to implement them into our routes. So here's the delete item, and it does the run function from the SQLite 3 package, and then it'll just output if the item was deleted or not. And then here's the get all items. We're to return all the items that once it is finished running this query. So in the next video, what we'll do is we'll test these functions out, we'll add them to our routes, and then we'll look at some of the HTML, and we'll be well on our way. Stay tuned.